Well, hi everybody, and thanks for your time this afternoon. So we're going to talk about this topic of, do you really have product market fit? And the reason that I've selected this topic is because in all the startups that I work with, the most common problem I see, and I also include my own personal mistakes in this set, but the most common problem is that a lot of us declare product market fit when we don't really have it. We believe we have it, but we don't. And all the consequential decisions we make with that belief are very painful to unwind and sometimes are catastrophic. So what I want to do in this short time we have together today is try to give you some practical tools to predict when you are heading towards product market fit or when you are not, and some advice on how you should organize around that topic. It really is the most important topic at certain early stages of a startup's life. And if you find this area difficult, you're not alone, because mistakes get made even in the most esoteric environments on this topic. For example, oops, excuse me, there we go. For example, you might well remember Farmville, which was one of the initially very successful Facebook apps way back in 2009. And this graph here shows that there was explosive interest in the product. And had you been an investor, for example, you would have perhaps thought this was a great thing to get on board with. And many did, with Zynga Games, the company that produces Farmville. Now, what happened after that point was quite dramatic. And this is a very common occurrence in startups, and especially those that are very well funded or get initial virality. You get this jumping the shark graph, as it's called. It's common enough to have a name, and it's called jumping the shark simply because it looks like a shark's fin. No more mathematical reason than that. Now, if we look at another example, this time a company called Vidi, and Vidi was the TikTok of its day, in a sense that it was a social media app that used video as the sharing currency. Now, its performance was even more exciting in the early days, really rocketing growth in registered users between January and May 2012. And so much so that some very savvy Silicon Valley investors got on board at that point. So in May 2012, the company raised $30 million and had 30 million registered users, not active users, but registered users. Important difference, as we'll see. And this is some of the coverage from, in this case, VentureBeat. And it's very kind of complimentary, and even Snoop Dogg was endorsing it. So when Snoop Dogg endorses your startup, then you're either going to be really successful or you're in significant trouble. And the trouble was where the company went, because shortly after that point, the company's active user base collapsed. Now, there's an interesting question here of how can, among the most savvy investors in the Silicon Valley, who see dozens of companies almost on a daily basis, how can they get this so wrong? How can they think that a company has really nailed the product market fit and then so quickly afterwards lose everything? So that's what we want to look at here. And I think the first problem we find with product market fit is that the definitions of it are very anecdotal. The Lean Startup's a great place to start, by the way. If you haven't read that, I highly recommend it. But across all the industry experts, you tend to get very anecdotal definitions. So for example, product market fit is when people sell for you. That's a great attribute of product market fit, but it's not very useful when you're trying to steer your company towards product market fit. So we need something that's a little bit more quantified and something we can practically use as a tool on a day-to-day and week-to-week basis. So to set the scene for our presentation here, this is the question we're trying to answer. How do we usefully know when we really have product market fit? And we can't do this topic complete justice in the time we have, but I want to get a couple of important points on the table that you can think about after this. And the place we're going to start is here on the user journey. And this is the journey that every user or customer goes through to some extent or another regarding your product. Not all users make it through all of these steps, of course, but this is where we start, because of course product market fit is about your users. It's about a sufficiently large number of them staying with your product. So let's follow the journey through and see where the critical areas are here. So of course, we first of all start by acquiring a cohort of users. So that means making them aware of our product, bringing them to our product. And then the task is to activate them. Now, activate here means to try to encourage them as quickly as possible to form a habit around your product. So for example, if I want to book a flight today, I will think immediately of SkyScanner. I wouldn't really sort of consider options. It's just a habit. If I want to book a hotel, I'll think of booking.com and so on. So we want to get people into that automatic habit mode, and that's what activation's about. And once we get them there, then we want to retain them in that habit. And retention, of course, is where two very important things happen. The first is that we can monetize our users in that state, and only when they're in that state. So monetization can be, of course, subscriptions or adverts or selling people something, etc. But they only do that when they're retained. And the other very important aspect is that they only tell their friends and family, etc., or other businesses and so on about your product when they're retained, because that reminds them to do it, and you can prompt them to do it when they're in your product. And referring new users is super important because it essentially is the foundations of exponential growth. And it's very desirable that we can encourage that in our product. So retention is absolutely key here. And retention is the foundation of product market fit. Now, probably we all know that to one extent or another, but I'm often struck how little we actually organize our companies around that fact. And my proposition is that if we did, then we would get far better results in terms of speed to find product market fit or speed to realize that you don't have it. Now, to see how important it actually is, let's drill into this a little bit. And the graph we're looking at here is along the x-axis, we have time periods. Now, that could be, let's say, months for this example. It doesn't really matter for the illustration, but let's say months. And up the y-axis, we have active users, not registered users, as in the example with Vidi, but people who are actually in the habit regarding our product. So they habitually use it according to some frequency. Now, this is a theoretical case. This is a case where we never lose users that we acquire. So for example, all the users that we acquire in time period 2, they're all still active in time period 3. So obviously life isn't quite like that, but it's a good place to baseline. Now, even then, you can see the graph isn't straight or exponential in our favor. It levels off towards a horizontal. And the reason for that is that markets are not infinite. So if we x-ray this graph and see what's happening inside, then what we see here is a number of cohorts that are acquired in different time periods. So the gray line, for example, the gray bar, is all the users that are acquired in cohort 1. And because we have zero churn in this case, that bar is horizontal for all time. And then the blue bar is all the users that we have acquired in period 2, and so on. And you'll see that these bars get thinner as we go forward. And that's because the more of a market we penetrate, the harder it is to find new users to acquire. So for example, 10 years ago, I could probably have found 10 people I know who don't use Facebook. But if I tried to recommend 10 people today to the product, it'd be very hard to find them because lots of people are using it now. So it gets harder and harder to acquire. And this gives us this leveling off. And this is our baseline for what we're going to look at next. Now, let's say that I now change things a little bit and I add in a small amount of churn. So we've now got 1% churn here. Now, what that means is in time period 2, for example, all the users that were active then, by the time we get to time period 3, we've lost 1% of them. And we've also added users because we're continuing to acquire. And the net result of both of those forces at work gives us the graph you see here. It's not quite the same as the original because, first of all, it doesn't rise as high. It's about 1,000 less in this example in terms of active users because we're leaking them all over the time periods. And secondly, when we eventually saturate the market, which albeit might take a long time to do, but when we saturate it, retention starts to dominate and we start to slowly decline. And even with this very small amount of churn, eventually you can see that this product would have no users if it saturated its market. So even with a small amount of churn, you can see how important retention is to a product, and in turn very important to revealing whether or not you've product market fit, because people aren't staying with this product here. Now let's x-ray this example and see what's going on. Now, very similar to the last example, except this time you can see that every cohort starts to very slowly narrow as it goes from left to right, and that's what adds up to this problem that we're seeing here. But you could argue that, well, we've got plenty of time here to fix this problem, to add features that make people stay longer, change our marketing approach, etc., etc. And that's true. Or you could argue that we could break out from the UK, for example, and go to Spain and France and Italy and continue to grow that way. And that's true as well. But underlying, there's a problem there. But it's not a serious one. But let's look at what happens when we start to turn up the churn dial a little bit. So let's now take the churn up to 5% or 10 and so on. And you can see that very, very quickly things become catastrophically worse. So the aggregate graphs here show that very, very quickly this product, with those levels of churn, will lose all of its users. And that starts to look a little bit like the graphs we saw earlier, doesn't it? So we can see here that retention dominates, and you don't have to have an awful lot of loss between cohorts for that to become a very rapidly established effect. So key lessons so far: retention always dominates in the end. So you've got to give it a lot of attention, and poor retention kills a product no matter how strong your acquisition performance. And what we saw with those Silicon Valley startups from earlier is that they had lots of investor money to throw at acquisition, but they didn't have retention. Now let's return to this graph here. And what we've established so far is that retention matters and is a root of indication of product market fit. But that's not really enough to be able to wrangle with this concept in a day-to-day basis. So let's see if we can improve on this a little bit. So we're going to select one of these cohorts, and now let's x-ray that and see what's going on inside. And you can see a familiar pattern. You can see that each of these cohorts narrows very, very rapidly. Let's select one of them and consider, how could we use this information in a way that allows teams to proactively take action to establish or improve our odds of product market fit. So let's take this data now and put it onto a different type of graph, similar but different in important ways. And here we have it. So this graph again shows time periods on the x-axis. Let's call them weeks here, just for variety. And this time on the y-axis, what we're looking at is the percentage of users that sign up on day one. So it's always 100% on day one, because I've just signed up, that are still active in all the time periods after that sign up. Now, the power of this chart is it allows us to put all the cohorts from every week or every month, depending how you measure your cohorts, allows us to put them all in the same graph, because they all start at the same point of 100%, regardless of the absolute number of people that sign up. And my message to you regarding this chart is that this, to my mind, is by far the most important chart and piece of data that any startup can have. Out of all the things you could have, this is the most important. And basically, what it allows you to do is see how cohorts are behaving over time, and knowing that if they're behaving in a certain way, they'll eventually aggregate up to an overall retention figure, and you'll get an early indication with these cohorts, if you analyze them, whether or not you are trending towards product market fit or not. So for example, let's take the green line here. This is I'll call it the kind of practically ideal scenario. What you see at the start here is that the green line falls pretty rapidly, and that's because not everyone who signs up actually wants to use your product. They might be trying it out. They didn't activate, in other words. So the initial curve is an activation loss. And clearly, you'd want to have a team working on improving that so the graph doesn't fall so sharply at the start, but you're always going to get some activation loss. But as long as your graph goes horizontal, as the green line does at the top, then you've got a business. And yes, you can work on trying to make it bottom out at a higher percentage, but you've basically got a business here. Now, if, as is more likely, more common, you have the yellow line, the middle line here, then you have work to do, because this cohort shows that although we we don't lose everybody at once. We are still losing users over time, and eventually that's going to net out to zero. And the red line shows that we've got a pretty severe problem, and we should either pivot or find ourselves a better job somewhere else. So these three graphs in summary correspond to the aggregate graphs we saw earlier, as you can see illustrated. So the kind of zero churn case is similar to the cohort behavior you see here, except you lose some initial users here in practice, but eventually it nets out to a pretty smooth horizontal. So that's a business. The yellow line, the middle line, corresponds to that kind of 1% churn case we saw. Churn is low but continuous and doesn't bottom out. And the bottom line there corresponds to the jumping the shark graphs. So if you don't have these graphs today in your business, if you can't instantiate them on a regular basis, that's job one, I would propose. And if you can, then job two is to organize your entire company around making those yellow graphs go green, make them go horizontal. And a summary of all that is green is viable, work to do in yellow, and heading for failure is red. So that's why these are so important. So the answer to the question of, in summary, how do we usefully know when we have product market fit, is our cohort graphs flatten out. It's as simple as that. Now, to finish, I want to illustrate one common mistake that's relevant to what we just talked about. This is a snapshot from the New York Times in early March. And on the left-hand side there is a graph of the exponential rise of COVID-19 cases and sadly deaths behind it. And underneath it are all of the things Donald Trump said in the early days of COVID. I don't expect you to be able to read all those. I'll just quickly summarize the points. And the points are that end of January he said, we've only got 5 cases in the whole of the US. So what's all the fuss about, people? And a month later he said, we've only got 15 cases, and within a couple of days that's going to 0. So nothing to worry about, nothing to see here. And then 129 cases in March, but that's nothing compared to the annual flu, etc. Now, you can see the problem here is that Mr. Trump was mistaking these points on a line as steady state indications as opposed to just points on an exponential graph. And we can all kind of mock that, and so we should. But it's amazing how often we make the same mistake in reverse in the startup world. So, for example, you can imagine, I've seen pitches to investors whereby the founder says, in answer to the question of what's your retention rate, the answer is it's 80%. After 4 weeks, we retain 80% of our users. And I've seen investors nod and say, that's great. But these guys have got 80% retention. People start quoting 80% retention. Or perhaps on a different roll of the dice, a different conversation would have said, our retention after 3 months is 50%. So, the implication is that that's a bit like our green cohort graph. But of course, what if these are just 2 points on a falling exponential? That's a very, very common mistake that we make. So the key point here is that retention is a trend. It's not a number. It's not a static point in time. And we've got to overcome our human desire to see the world as either stable or linear. The world, when it comes to retention, much as it does with viruses, is somewhat exponential or follows polynomial behaviors. And we've got to try and inculcate that into our thinking and overcome our founder optimism about what's happening with our product. So the summary of all that is, recapping, this is when we usefully know when we have product market fit. And I would urge you to establish those data views in your company, and and don't be overly optimistic or overly complacent about reading what those are telling you. Okay, so I will hand back on that note to Sophie.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Mark. That was fantastic. I'll dive straight into questions. So one from Gavin was, how do you calculate interest index? I think that was on your first product growth graph. Is that with Google Trends, or is there something else that is useful there?
Yeah, I'm just using Google Trends there as a proxy for active users in those historical cases, because actually it's a pretty good proxy. I mean, there's a lot of fancy tools we can use to analyze data, but it's amazing how useful Google Trends is. It's only a proxy, so like all proxies, it's imperfect, but it's pretty useful. So yeah, I would much prefer in your own business you used the internal data you have on actual active users. Now that does raise an interesting question as to what is an active user, and it's very easy to get that wrong. So you've got to think about what constitutes activity, and we can talk about that more, but for now I just want to park that thought as think hard about what constitutes an active user. An active user implies that someone has a habit established with your product. So what is the habit? How do you measure the habit? For now though, for the sake of this presentation, I've just used Google Trends as a neat proxy.
Great. So we had another question actually come in before your presentation, Mark, from Kevin Hall, who says, what was product market fit in January is more likely not in post-COVID world. What recommendations do you have for a product team to quickly understand those changes in the market?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. I think that there's a reason why startups that start during crisis or during recessions do quite well. And the answer is that, or the reason for that, sorry, is that they look at the world as it currently stands. What opportunities exist at this time. For example, Airbnb famously started during the 2008 recession because it could look at the world as it stood at that time, and it saw that what people didn't have was money, so they wanted still to travel and so on, so they could stay somewhere more cheaply. Whereas if you already have a company, so let's say to Kevin's example, in January, you've got a company with a certain view of the world, and then in March, the world has changed. We find it very difficult to look at the world afresh. There's an analogy when you're playing chess, and even top grandmasters suffer from this. They had a plan, then they make a mistake, so the board no longer shows what they originally thought, but they're still following the old plan because it was comforting to them, or they'd invested time in it. There was a sunk cost in that in terms of intellectual effort, so they're not willing to reassess the position on the board in front of them. Very, very common human problem. So my advice would be, and obviously all the businesses on this call today are different, so specific advice can't be given here, but my advice is try to reset from scratch, as if you're a consultant coming into your company, or you've just joined it as the new chief operating officer or something, and try and reassess it from the ground up. Because it's very hard for us to do that. We want to cling to what used to be true, and it's very hard to see how we should change in those circumstances.
Thanks, Mark. So a question from Jamie Sunderland was, when was it you realized SkyScanner had product market fit? I guess kind of an additional question would be, did you see it as a trend at that time?
It's interesting, the SkyScanner example, because I want to avoid revisionism that I was criticizing the general population for earlier. In our early days, we didn't do a very good job of this. We had product market fit because we had, looking back, we can tell we had it because we had exponential growth in users, and you only get exponential growth if you're not leaking users from your existing cohorts. But I don't think we were in the early days particularly, or even for a long time after, particularly scientific about understanding retention in our business. We really struggled with it, and one big reason we struggled with it was because we didn't really know who our users were. We didn't have logged in users, so we had to rely on various proxies like cookies, and they were imperfect. And then when mobile came along, users would be across both platforms, and we couldn't really reconcile them. So, the lesson it taught me is to pay attention to how you're going to know your users and understand what they're doing. Build that into the product as much as you can at the start, because it's very hard to retrofit it. Because I often reflect on, we tend to get anchored on what we think good is. So SkyScanner grew pretty rapidly, and that all felt good. But I was always nagged by the suspicion that maybe we were growing a tenth as fast as we should have been. So maybe we sort of had product market fit, but we didn't have great product market fit, but we couldn't really tell because the data couldn't tell us. And because the graphs were going up and to the right, we felt a little bit complacent about that point. Not complacent overall, because we never felt that, but a bit complacent as we've achieved product market fit. In other words, my point is that product market fit is a is not an absolute. It varies by degree. You know, you can have quite good product market fit or really good product market fit. And I was always nagged by the suspicion that we didn't know. So I wouldn't hold SkyScanner up as an example of, I mean, it's a great company and it's great people work there, but in this particular area, we were only semi-sighted on that point, and we were fortunate that our product, you know, basically had landed in the right spot. But had we met difficulties, like had the market met turmoil, we'd have found it more difficult to get insight into what was going on. So when I talk with startups today, I urge them to start with getting a basic view into user retention and to reflect on what an active user is. And if you haven't got that visibility, get that first, because otherwise every decision you make thereafter will be inaccurate.
So just conscious of time, I know it's approaching 1 o'clock. Mark is happy to stay around for a little bit to discuss some more questions. So feel free, all of you, to stay on if you want to. I've got another question come in from Ronnie Somerville, who's asked, what would be your recommended decision matrix for removing features from a product, or do you have any advice on that?
Well, that's an interesting question. You know, I think removing features and adding features are exactly the same events, because what you're doing is experimenting to see what improves your user behavior on your site or your user retention, for example. We tend to associate features with some mystical property. You know, there was a time, I remember when I was a software engineer, practicing software engineer, product person, like many other people at the time, I thought that the job of product was to add features, and if you added features, people would come. Those of you who are old enough to remember the evolution of Microsoft Word will remember that's exactly what Microsoft thought too, until the point where the product was so bloated with features that you couldn't navigate it. And therefore, the first thing to remember is that features are not the goal, retention is the goal. And one of the tools you can wield is to add some features. You've got to have some core features, obviously, to have a product, but beyond that, features are something that may or may not improve retention. It might actually reduce retention. And there's other things you can do in terms of your marketing messaging, the timing of notifications, the friction or otherwise with which you go through the onboarding process. And these aren't really feature discussions. So to Ronnie's question, removing features is often a great thing to do if, for example, it streamlines the onboarding process or the direct line of sight to value of the product. And I would, if you've got a lot of features today, I suggest that you put those into the experimentation mix with everything else. Try taking some out, try simplifying some, in the same way as you might try adding things to improve retention. We don't like doing that because, of course, humans don't do well with sunk costs, but it's certainly, in my view, identical when you remove a feature as it is to adding one in terms of how you think about it.
Okay, great. I think we've lost Sophie there. I'll just move on to the next one. So Matt Dunn has asked, do you have any tips for analysing a new product's potential for market fit, brackets, something that's pre-launch?
Well, that's a good question. Not really. I mean, you can certainly you can go and ask people what they think. Would they use this product? You can use all the techniques that we're familiar with about concierging, Wizard of Ozing, all those things to see if there's some interest in your product. And if you're not familiar with those terms, again, I'd urge you to read the Lean Startup and associated material. But those techniques are basically about, in summary, not building the full product, just building as little as possible to try and see if people really engage. But the key point here is that what people say they will do and what they actually do are not the same thing. And you know, you can see that in voters' intentions, for example, where people, if you ask them a question, you know, do you think we should raise taxes to fund the NHS? They'll say yes. And if you ask them who they're going to vote for, they'll give you a certain answer, but they'll vote differently in a polling booth. Very famous example from about 15 years ago here in the UK. So anything that allows you to get insight into what people do rather than what they say is valuable, which is why these techniques of, you know, concierging or Wizard of Ozing are quite useful. But you'll never get a perfect readout until you actually start putting the product out there in various stages of evolution.
Great, thanks. So the next one is from Julie Grieve, and she asks, how does B2B vary from B2C on PMF? Is it just lower numbers?
Well, that's a great question, because the greater complexity with B2B is that, excuse me, whereas with consumer B2C, the customer is atomic. You know, the customer is the atom of the exercise. In the case of B2B, the customer has layers. So there's the company itself that might buy your product. Then there's the users of the product inside the company. And then there's the buyers of the product who get to decide if it's going to get purchased. And they all have different considerations when it comes to approaching them. My view on this, my experience and the experience of other people that I've spoken to about it, is that you have to pick one of those subparts and focus on it as your user. So for example, if you look at what Slack has done, for example, or Zoom, they didn't treat the atom as the company and go and sell to the CIO. They didn't go and approach the CFO. They basically spirited these products into their companies via the users themselves. And then the users became the evangelists to put pressure on the company to buy those products. So, you know, if I was to pick a piece of advice, it'd be the atom you want to have is the users. So when you're measuring activity, it's not, you know, how often the company renews its contract. That's a very lagging indicator. It's the people inside the company. Are they using your product and in what way? And if you get that right, there's a pretty good chance that the rest of it will take care of itself. So for me, B2B is similar to B2C. There's more complexity in terms of upward selling, but you want to treat the users of the product, the employees of that company, in a very similar way to you would with the consumers in a B2C product.
Great. So the next one is from, I think it's Liza, is how I pronounce it. She asks, how long should you test the retention before you pivot? 3 cohorts, ? Or whatever advice you have for that.
Well, you know, this takes us to the question of frequency of use. So it kind of depends on the frequency of use of your product. So for example, the reason travel is such a difficult area to start a business is because the frequency of use is very low. So if I was to, you know, to measure whether or not I'd product market fit by how often, you know, someone used my product, if I measured that in the same frequency as I would with a social media product, I'd assume no one likes my product. So with travel, your best customer books, you know, twice a year, for example. With social media, they should use your product, you know, a couple of times a day, perhaps. So you've got to really build this around frequency. But but with that said, you know, let's assume the frequency was quite high, so you could establish trends quite early. I wouldn't pivot after 3 cohorts. I mean, pivoting means that you're going to change something very significant. And I think before you do that, you have to have exhausted things like, is my onboarding just a bit too cumbersome? You know, do I ask for a credit card too soon before I've established some value to the customer that would give them the willingness to sign up? So these are not pivots, these are tweaks. And I wouldn't panic about it. I would let a number of cohorts run until you had exhausted those kind of things, and then use that as your guide to when you pivot, rather than any kind of absolute number, because it really depends what you're doing between cohorts. You know, if you're doing nothing at all to explore these issues, then 3 cohorts will go by with no change. But if you're actively trying a lot of different things, then you maybe would be forgiven for pivoting earlier. So these are the variables that really matter more than any absolute number of cohorts.
Okay, great. And then the next one is from Alex. So he's saying that this talk's been very useful. All the examples that you've mentioned are for businesses that have many users and continued active users as a metric of success. Do the same rules apply for physical products and high ticket items where users will maybe only buy once or once every few years?
Well, you know, the same physics applies, but it's much harder. You know, frequency is helpful. This is why even in a product that might ultimately have a lot of users, this is why establishing product market fit is super difficult, because you don't have enough statistical mass to know what if what you're seeing is valid. So in the early days, and this is a problem we discuss in a lot of companies I'm involved in the early days you have to go, think of a spectrum. At one side it's all just going on your hunch, and at the other end of the spectrum it's all based on data. And people who tell you can't make decisions without data are being naive, because you have to make decisions without full data quite often. And the earlier a startup is in its life, the more that's the case. So it is difficult, and it's very similar to the case where you just don't have, a lot of purchases, even at steady state. And that's why these businesses are correspondingly harder to grow, harder to succeed with. It reminds me of another case where in the early days, you're very dependent on founder hunches. And because founder hunches, if you stay in business, founder hunches get reinforced as a way of doing things. The founder takes on some kind of almost kind of a deified status. And the founders have trained themselves to believe that when they have a hunch, it's always right. But as the business grows and gets to a higher frequency of users, it's vital that you move towards using data, because you've now got data. But very often CEOs, for example, and similar people, remember when their hunches were the compass and won't let go of hunching, and don't pay attention to data because they know best. So this is a really interesting area, but the summary of it is there's hunches at one side of the spectrum, there's data at the other end. In the early days of a startup, the blend is more towards hunches because you just ain't got frequency. And that's also true of those very low frequency businesses at steady state. As you build frequency, as you build data validity, statistical validity, you've got to force yourselves to start to bring that data in and start to deprecate hunches in the business. They'll never go away completely, nor should they, but it's amazing how many startups are still waiting for the white smoke to emerge from the founder's office before they make a decision, when they should have been using the data that the more recent employees had available.
Okay, so this one's from David. It's kind of building on that, and I know that you mentioned data there. He says, where it's not possible to build quantitative analytics into a product, are there any qualitative techniques that you would recommend instead?
Well, I'm a great believer in relativistic measures and thought experiments. So if you haven't got data, then there's a lot you can figure out just by, for example, cause and effect, or by comparing two things and saying, I don't know the exact number, but I know this is bigger than yesterday, or bigger than last month, or so on. So, I would always advocate that you build a qualitative model of your situation before you go to data. And that can be super useful. You can reason about how users might behave, and then any insights you can get from them anecdotally or any partial data in the context of a qualitative model of how they might act can be very, very useful. And then you can start to illustrate it with data over time. So I'd start with a qualitative model, because that's the intellectual framework and it sets the terminology you're going to use in your business. And then you can start to add to that later. So, for example, let's take the British economy. Now, it's very, very complicated, and I don't have the exact data of today's inflation rate, but I do know that if interest rates go up, inflation tends to go down, because people are less willing to borrow money to go and buy stuff because it's too expensive. And likewise, if interest rates go down, inflation tends to go up. Now, that's a kind of qualitative model. And I haven't mentioned any data there, but it's super useful to know that. And it can guide policy before data is even available. So you'll have analogies in your own business. So the summary is, build a qualitative model. That's much better than hunches, much better. Creates an intellectual framework and rigor in your business. You can always tweak it over time, and then inform it as soon as you can with data. And decision making then becomes a blend of those three things, I guess. Hunches when you've got nothing else. A qualitative models, which are super powerful, which eventually become the skeleton for your quantitative models. And be super careful with rushing straight to data when you have no idea its qualitative context.
Okay, great, thanks. So we've got two more. So one from Mike. He says, with regards to retention, how do you think we can separate people who are retained because nothing better has arrived, or because they are in love with the product? So in other words, what about fragile retention?
Yeah, that's a really interesting concept. My view is that all retention is fragile because, you know, if something comes along that's better, I'm probably going to move to that because it's better. You know, like I was quite fond of my my VHS recorder not that long ago, and I was quite fond of my DVD player, but I'm now streaming movies. So you know, all retention is fragile. So I don't make a distinction there. Now, I think what might be getting at there is within that, you know, one way you can tell about how strong your retention is there's different levels of engagement with your product. So, for example, you know, if I use Facebook once a month and you know you use Facebook 10 times a day, we're both monthly active users, but you're far more engaged than I am, and I'm more likely to churn than you are. So you can get insight into the intensity of use, the engagement level of your customers. And that is super useful because if you see me going from being very engaged to only a bit engaged, you can potentially take action there. You can send me an email saying, we haven't seen you for a while, you know, those kind of things. That can all be automated. But even the most, you know, most wholehearted user, you've got to think they are fragile if something better comes along. So, you know, that's always a risk. Nothing lasts forever.
Absolutely. Okay, so the final question of the day is from Russell, who's asking, can the route of acquisition be typified as an indicator of likely retention? For example, on Vidi's acquisition, was it dependent upon Facebook's social graph?
Yeah, I think that's true. So for example, you know, generalizing that, in any product will probably have multiple sources of acquisition, and all of those will perform differently for different reasons. You know, the function of the channels, context, the function of how smooth your conversion is, etc. But I can see that in you know, in principle terms, you could get some insights there. You know, like for example, this reminds me a bit of the difference between power users and casual users. You know, power users will find your product and they'll put up with a lot of friction because they really value the value it offers, and casual users won't. And you'll tend to find power users in one forum and casual users elsewhere. It's also why often you find that the users you acquire in the early days of a company are far more engaged because they evangelize the product, they really wanted it. And as you use up that supply, you start moving out to people who are more indifferent, and you know, they'll be harder to keep. So I do think there's variation on where people come from and what type of users they are. So I would certainly agree with that. And I think that's why the more insight you can build over time as to everything about your users, the better. I wouldn't start with trying to build a Death Star data model that does everything, but you're never done in building visibility of what your users are doing. And going back to my comment earlier about our SkyScanner days, we got much better at this, much better, but I'd love to in the earlier days had more visibility as to where those people were coming from, why they were coming from there, but we couldn't even ask them because we didn't really know who they were for much of our life. We got better at this, but it was always a problem. So don't build in those problems at the start. You know, try to create a landscape where you can, over a period of years, even, you know, get more and more visibility and granularity of what people are doing and why they're doing it.